Hey guys, it's me, Mr. 250, and welcome back to Banshee's Last Cry. So far, people seem to be enjoying it. I know some people, somebody said that they wanted to play it first before they saw it, which is understandable. I certainly could understand that actually pretty well. The only ones to see the corpse were the three of us. Mr. Forrest, Grace, and myself. Mr. Forrest hustled everyone else away from the room before they could even look. We were unable to tell the others what we saw for a while. All we could do was sip our cocoa, and try to stop ourselves from trembling or throwing up. "Come on, can't you tell us what you saw in there?" Abby asked impatiently. I glanced briefly over at Mr. Forrest, but he didn't seem to even have heard what Abby said. I struggled to answer, my voice barely more than a croak. He's dead. Cut into pieces. Dead. I heard the sound of Abby swallowing hard. Cut into pieces? What do you mean? I don't know if Abby thought I was making some kind of a bad joke or what, but I just snapped. What do I mean? What do I mean? Without being aware of it, my voice rose and rose until I was shouting. Cut into pieces, okay? Tiny little pieces. Head, feet, hands, body. All cut up and stacked like blocks, okay? Now do you get it? Ah! A woman let out an ear-piercing scream and started to cry. It was Molly. Was it that Mr. Jones guy? Tiffany asked in a quiet voice. Yeah, I think so. It was hard to tell since his face was, anyway, yeah, I think so. Suddenly, Abby's eyes narrowed. Are you sure it wasn't one of those, Hollywood dummies? Believe me, that was no dummy. My body started shaking as I remembered peering into a cross-section of one of those chunks of flesh. Yeah, but the special effects these days are really amazing, right? Maybe it was just super realistic. When she put it like that, I have to admit, I started to gradually lose confidence. It was real, no doubt about it. There was blood all over. Upon hearing Mr. Forrest say it with such finality, Tiffany raised her voice to a near scream. Oh my God! The note was real! I want to go home! You know, this reminds me of something. The legend of the Banshee. Faber's chewed thoughtfully on his lip. Banshee? Yeah, never heard of it. There used to be Irish immigrants all around here during the gold rush years. They used to say that on some nights they could hear the sound, like a shriek in the wind, and, more often than not, they'd wake the next morning to find a broken window and someone dead in bed with strange cuts in their body. They say the howl of the Banshee is so piercing, it can shatter glass and even slice flesh. Faber spoke in a low voice, staring intently at each of us. The brief, uncomfortable silence was broken when Mr. Forrest snorted derisively even. So you're saying that a Banshee broke the glass and then, what, screamed at him to death? That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Grace jumped in too. Besides, that was just some natural phenomenon. The wind blowing through the pine trees, right? It wouldn't have taken too much wind to break those old glass windows either. But Faber refused to budge. That's one way of thinking about it. But if you ask me, the natural world and the supernatural aren't as far apart as some people like to think. I've heard about people getting windburned sometimes, but not getting sliced up into little pieces, I said. If there's something supernatural at work, who can say what's possible? Nice and spooky, right? Come on, don't look at me like that. I'm not saying I believe in ghosts. Let's call it a natural phenomenon then. But just listen to that wind. Have you ever heard it scream like that before? If you can believe the wind can blow hard enough to uproot a full-grown tree, is it really impossible for it to kill a person? A wind that could break glass and then rip the limbs off of a person standing in front of the window. Was it really possible? More supernatural stuff. Spooky. Plasma. It could have been plasma. Molly, who had been standing there looking frightened, suddenly burst out. What do you mean by plasma, Molly? Debbie asked, a puzzled look on her face. I'm not totally sure, but I know I'm right. It's the only explanation. Unless I missed something, there hadn't been any explanation at all, but Molly looked so convinced that I found myself nodding anyway. So what about that note? We know someone had to, write it, yeah? Well, yeah, but then, before she could finish her sentence, Molly's face crumbled and she started to cry again. Hey, I know I asked this before, but what note are you all talking about? There was a note of hesitation in Faberge's voice. Mr. Forrest looked quickly over at me, but I didn't think there was any reason to hide the truth anymore. Well, earlier tonight, not long after we showed up. When I was finished, everyone was speechless for a while. That's pretty intense, Faberge muttered to himself. Y'all had no right to keep that from us, Mr. Buchanan sighed resentfully. But like my mama said, you can't close the barn door after the horses are all gone away. Anyway, we ought to go ahead and call the boys in blue, assuming that thing really is a corpse. Oh God, the police! Why hadn't I even thought of that? I guess when you're confronted with something so hard to believe, you lose the ability to think straight. On reflex, I reached into my pocket for my phone. Then I remembered that there was no reception here at the inn. Everyone else must have been thinking the same thing, because I saw several others make the exact same motion for their pockets. Mr. Forrest stood up and went to the landline. He lifted the handset and put it to his ear, but then his face shifted to one of irritation, and he started to punch angrily up and down on the cradle. Crap, I can't even get a dial tone. What in tarnation? Mr. Buchanan stood up and shouted. That's crazy. The phone lines must have come down. Mr. Forrest stared at the receiver in his hand like it had personally betrayed him. We can't call anyone. It took some time for the full weight of that realization to sink in. If we couldn't call anyone, and if it was still snowing like this tomorrow, we wouldn't be able to reach the police. And that wasn't all. It meant that none of us would be leaving either. Mr. Buchanan was starting to laugh. Ha! What was I thinking? I still got my cell phone. We'll just use that. You're really doing a great job of not filling out the stereotypical role. But Mr. Forrest responded immediately. Don't waste your time. There's no cell phone reception for miles. What about the internet? We have an internet connection in our room, Debbie shouted, her eyes bright with sudden hope. But Mr. Forrest, sounding drained of all strength, replied, It's a DSL line. If the phones are down, so's the internet connection. Well, what the heck's we supposed to do? There's some crazy psycho hanging around here. Crazy psycho. Hearing that was like a punch in the stomach. We were also transfixed by the gruesome corpse and all the wild speculation about banshees and plasma that we hadn't even noticed that there was a murder in our midst. On second thought, maybe we were all subconsciously trying to avoid thinking about it. It couldn't have been an accident or suicide. The most natural explanation was murder. Someone had killed Mr. Jones and dismembered his corpse. And, like Mr. Buchanan said, considering the state of the weather, there was a strong possibility the murderer was still here. Do you think we could get down the mountain in this weather, I asked? But Mr. Forrest and Bobby shook their heads almost at the same time. No chance, Bobby answered first. To be honest, it was practically a miracle that Mr. Faberge made it here safely. If we tried to walk down, we'd freeze to death. And if we drove, we'd either get stranded or, at worst, slip on the snow and fall off a cliff. Yeah, but if the murder's hiding somewhere in the inn, it's either that or... well, what happens to us? Everyone gasped when I said that. Even Molly stopped crying long enough to stare upward, a panicked expression on her face. Bobby stood up angrily. So what? We're gonna spend the night in here with someone that has chopped a person into little bits? Are you serious? Bobby here is right. With a maniac like that running around, ain't nobody gonna get to sleep. We gotta do something, Mr. Buchanan said loudly. Like what? Mr. Forrest seemed bewildered. Why, nab the varmint, of course. If the sheriff ain't around, you gotta form a posse. Hold on just a minute. The words coming out of Faberge sounded surprisingly weak and frightened. The complete opposite of what I expected to hear from such a powerfully built man. We're talking about a stone-cold killer that's dismembered someone. Instead of doing something stupid, wouldn't it be smarter just to stay here and watch our backs? With this many people together, even a crazed killer wouldn't dare to try anything. You reckon we could stay awake all night? Because if we go to sleep, we might all wind up butchered like hogs before Christmas. Hearing that from Mr. Buchanan, the expression on the three girls' faces went from frightened to absolutely terrified. I quickly interjected, "Come on, even the craziest killer couldn't get away with that. We're definitely going to need to lock our doors, though." "Lock our doors? The gosh dang maniac is already in here." "He couldn't be. How would he have gotten in?" shouted Mr. Forrest in disbelief. "I ain't got the faintest idea. But what I do know is that he's already killed someone inside. So that means he somehow snuck past us without anyone noticing, right?" But... Mr. Forrest seemed at a loss for words. "I reckon our boy must have gotten in through the broken window. The snow in the back of the building ain't been cleared for a while, so it wouldn't be hard to get up onto the second floor." "Yeah, but even so, the murderer had to leave through the window too. The door was still locked," I said, stating what I thought was the obvious. "I don't know about that. These doors here, they got push-button locks. He could have just come in through the window and pushed the button on the door so it would lock when he left. Then he could have hid in the empty room, or maybe gone downstairs while we were around there." Mr. Buchanan was right about the doors. If you pressed the button on the inside and closed the door, it locked. All the rooms at the Snowflake Inn were like that. So, even if the door was locked, it didn't necessarily mean that the murderer had escaped through the window. But still, we had just checked out the entire upstairs. I couldn't imagine that he somehow snuck past us downstairs. "Well, whatever the truth is, don't you think we should get hold of some weapons?" Grace, who had been silent the whole time, finally spoke up. I had to admit, I was a little surprised that the idea came from her. "The little lady is right. Better safe than sorry. Let's do that right now." Everyone agreed it was a good idea, but what kind of weapons could we find in an inn like this anyway? In the end, we settled on ski poles, a fruit peeler, and some mop handles. Pretty sure that fruit peeler is the most dangerous one of all. We decided that kitchen knives could lead to accidents. You don't want to have accidents when you're trying to take down the murderer. So we took only the fruit peeler from the kitchen, which didn't exactly inspire me with courage. We're going to peel his skin off. Take that, murderer. Who's the bad guy now? Okay, y'all. We form up teams and go over this place with a fine-tooth comb. We look under beds, in closets, bathtubs, anywhere that varmint might be hiding. At some point, Mr. Buchanan took the leader role, like you would expect from a tough-talking Texas businessman. There were 5 men in total: Faberge, Mr. Forrest, Mr. Buchanan, and Bobby. After a bit of arguing, we voted to have the woman stay in the lounge. I guess we were all trying to put on a brave face. Be careful. Even those brief words of support from Grace were enough to give me courage. So, where should we start? Mr. Forrest asked no one in particular. I answered him anyway. Let's see, upstairs was where we found the body. Might not be a bad place to start. Let's start upstairs. And then we'll move downstairs. Let's start upstairs. Okay then, take point, fellas. Despite the fact that he had assumed the leader role, Mr. Buchanan asked Faberge and me to take the lead. Ah well. I took a firm grip on my ski pole, while Faberge hefted his mop handle. We headed to the rooms on the second floor. As Mr. Forrest prepared to open the door, Faberge and I readied our weapons. Okay, here goes. The two of us nodded at the same time. Mr. Forrest opened the door, and quickly stepped aside. Faberge and I, ski pole and mop handle thrust out in front of us, moved cautiously into the room. That was how we searched each room, from top to bottom. Only Faberge and I actually entered the rooms, while the other covered the exit. That way, the murderer wouldn't be able to run out of the room while we were searching. At first, we were almost paralyzed with fear, but after repeating the same procedure over and over, we gradually got bolder. Halfway through, Faberge had started to get some color back in his face. I assume that was the same for me. No matter how scary the guy is, it's 5 against 1. We can handle him, right? Yeah. We can handle this. We finished checking all of the guest rooms, but there was no sign of anyone. Hey, Billy boy, what's that door? Mr. Buchanan pointed to the door at the end of the hallway. That's the closet where we keep the cleaning supplies. I suppose it's possible someone could hide in there. Uh-oh. Oh. Suddenly, everyone stopped moving. Faber shot a question at me with his eyes. I swallowed nervously and nodded. Yeah, I'd heard it too. I gripped the ski pole tighter, beads of sweat popping out on my forehead. Mr. Forrest put his hand softly on the doorknob and looked around at us. We were all clumped close behind him, except for Mr. Buchanan, who was a little further back. We all nodded in turn, signaling at him to go ahead. The door opened. Inside were buckets filled with cleaning supplies, brooms, dustpans, rubber gloves, and other stuff. But there was no light, so we could only see them in silhouette. Anybody there? Faber whispered nervously into the darkness. No answer. I breathed a sigh of relief. I knew it. He must have escaped out the window. He'd have to be an idiot to run right into where we all... That's as far as I got. Ah! Oh, it's just a cat. Yeah. I actually like that. Don't worry, there aren't really many jump scares in this. That's probably one of the few. Suddenly, there was a rattle as one of the brooms started to fall towards us. Ah, there he is! Faber's eyes tightly shut started swinging his mop handle wildly. It's a cat. That's Ruby, so that's where she's been hiding, Bobby said. Ruby? She's the cat around the inn. I hadn't seen her in a while, so I was wondering where she was. I had no idea she was in here. Well, Mr. Forrest said, on to the first floor. Everyone was starting to think less and less likely that the murderer was still in the inn. We were significantly calmer when we headed back to the lounge. I may not look it now, but I played football back in high school. If that guy pops his head out, I'll put a flying tackle on him so quick it'll make his eyes pop out. I thought the timing of Mr. Buchanan's sudden urge of confidence was a little suspicious. Does that mean you're taking the lead from here on? I asked sarcastically. Mr. Buchanan suddenly got defensive. Believe me, son, I'd like nothing better. But I got this slip disc thing going on. Oh, there it goes again. Gosh darn it. If it weren't for this back of mine... I was way out of my league with this guy. Back in the lounge, Grace and the other women were worriedly awaiting our return. How'd it go? Grace asked. I just shook my head. The black cat had scared us so bad was now at Abby's feet, happily munching on her dinner. She had no idea what she put us through. Besides the front desk area, the first floor consisted of the 3 girls' room, Abby and Bobby's staff room, Mr. and Mrs. Forrest room, and the drawing room for the ski equipment. We took a look at each of them, but there was no way anyone was hiding there. So, there are no other rooms? I asked Mr. Forrest. He thought for a while and said, just the wine cellar, but that's locked. Looks like our boy ain't here after all. Too bad. I was gonna show him how I used to blitz the quarterback back in the good old days, Mr. Buchanan said, sounding frustrated. Oop, too fast. For all his talk about blitzing, the only thing he was good at was running his mouth. When we got back to the lounge, Colleen poured us some coffee. Didn't find anyone, huh? Grace said, reading the expression on my face. I guess he must have escaped outside after all. Probably, Bobby said. A complicated mixture of relief and anxiety crossed the faces of the others. I understood how they felt. For the time being, we were out of immediate danger, but we couldn't be sure the murderer wasn't still hiding somewhere. Even if he wasn't here now, he might come back in the middle of the night. And even with everything locked up tight, all he had to do was break another window. Hang on a second. We all assumed that the killer had come in through the broken window. But did he? So either the killer could have snuck in earlier, or I realized someone among us didn't have an alibi. Well, who doesn't have an alibi? Let's see. Trying to think. Grace was with us pretty much all the time. Those 3 girls, weren't they? They were by themselves. They could have been working together. Someone among us didn't have an alibi. I realized there was someone among us who didn't have the alibi. When we heard the window break, one person wasn't in the lounge. Oh, you mean that point. It was Bobby Trotter, the guy currently enjoying his cup of hot coffee next to me. He was the only one that had the opportunity to kill Mr. Jones. I snuck a look at his face. He looked for all the world like a friendly, cheerful snowboard instructor. But was that just a disguise? Huh? Something wrong? Bobby said, looking back at me. No, I just... Oh, the sugar. Sorry, here you go. Bobby passed the sugar bowl towards me. Thanks, I said, forcing myself to drop a sugar cube into my own coffee. Bobby seemed to have misread the reason for my glance. Could this trusting guy really be a crazy killer? No, it couldn't be. No matter the circumstances, there was no way this guy could have killed someone and chopped him into pieces. The real killer must have escaped outside after all. Yeah, obviously. Whoever he was, he had to be some kind of crazy madman. Not any of these other guests. That's right. The guy who killed Mr. Jones. I guess he really was connected to the Mafia. That's why he was targeted. Hello, train. I guess he was really connected to the Mafia. That's why he was targeted. I did my level best to convince myself that I was right. Mr. Forrest stood up suddenly. What is it? I'm gonna go check outside. Outside? But why? I thought there might be some kind of tracks. You know, footprints or tire marks. Bobby shook his head. Even if there were, they would have been covered up by the snow already. Mr. Forrest looked pained. Yeah, probably. But we can't just sit here and wait for the killer to come back. So we can either decide not to go or to go. I mean, if we're trying to get the girl after all, we should probably be man and go out with him. I'll go with you, I said, standing up. You're coming too, right, Mr. Buchanan? I mean, if the killer is out there, you can do that famous flying tackle on him. Mr. Buchanan was flustered at this. The thing is, it's cold out there, and I ain't too good with the cold. If y'all see him, just chase him in here. I'll show him my special tiger claw tackle. I can't believe this guy, I thought to myself. Besides, I was pretty sure there was no such thing as a tiger claw tackle. Well, obviously you haven't run into Mr. Buchanan when he's doing his flying claw tackle. In the end, the four of us, me, Mr. Forrest, Bobby, and Faberge, and by the way, I was calling him Faberge before, I was told I was incorrect, decided to go outside and have a look. We all headed to our rooms to change, then met 5 minutes later in the foyer. It was 10 o'clock. The four of us got our weapons ready and ventured outside. The moment we opened the door, we were hit by a blast of snow and razor-like wind. I quickly pulled my hood over my head and tightened the drawstring. Let's circle the building from both sides, Mr. Forrest shouted, trying to make himself heard over the roar of the wind. Max and I'll go right. Bobby and Mr. Faberge, you go left. How's that? Everyone nodded. As soon as we stepped off the porch, we found ourselves in a wintry hell. We split off into two groups, and laboriously started to make our way through the knee-deep snow. Don't get separated, Mr. Forrest shouted in the direction of Bobby and Faberge as they disappeared into the thick blanket of snow that surrounded us. But his voice was swallowed up by the scream of the storm. Even with my head down and my hood as tight as I could make it, I could feel icy needles slicing into the skin on my face. I can't see a thing out here. Even straining with my eyes wide open, I couldn't see more than a yard in front of me. In my hands, the ones nervously gripping the ski pole, were already starting to freeze despite the heavy gloves. Mr. Forrest! Mr. Forrest! I had already lost sight of him, and I was quickly starting to panic. No matter which way I turned, there was only snow, snow, and more snow. I couldn't even see the end anymore. I'd lost all sense of direction. I decided to... Well... They say in mazes you're supposed to go in one direction, and you'll find the way out. I'm not so sure that works if you're lost in the middle of the snow. Let's try right, though. But I couldn't, no matter how far I went, I couldn't see a single clue. Just a vicious whirlwind of snow. Mr. Forrest, where are you? My voice quivered with fear, and my cheeks felt like frozen blocks of ice. I decided it would be best to... Well, I mean, if we turn around and go back, assuming we don't get lost again, we'll be closer to wherever we were, right? I decided it would be best to go around and turn back. I returned in the direction I thought I had come from, in something like a shambling trot. But even after I was sure I'd traversed the right amount of distance, I still couldn't see the end. Let's keep going a bit more. So I kept going a bit more. All of a sudden, I felt a powerful crushing blow to my head, and I fell backwards into the snow. It felt like sinking gently into a soft feather bed. A strangely familiar feeling, both cold and warm at the same time. If I hadn't heard someone shouting just at that moment, I'm sure I would have happily gone to sleep. Then and there. "Max, Max, over here, hurry!" Mr. Forrest's shout came drifting to me in between the waves of piercing wind. Painfully, I managed to roll over and struggle back to my feet. A pulsing pain tore through the top of my head. When I looked up, the wall of the Snowflake Inn was right in front of me. It appeared that, rather than being hit over the head, I'd actually run headfirst into the inn. Despite my anger at my own clumsiness, I felt an even greater wave of relief. "Max, where are you?" Once again, I heard my name being called. "I'm over here," I yelled back as I followed along the wall. Sheltered by the building, I was glad to discover the wind was less intense than before. Walking in deep snow is hard work. Not only were my hands and feet frozen, I could feel sweat starting to drip down my back, and I was breathing hard. Finally, I reached the rear of the inn. Turning the corner, I spotted Mr. Forrest's back. "Mr. Forrest," I said as I got closer. Then I saw what had happened. Faberge laid crumpled at Mr. Forrest's feet. Bobby was doing his best to pull him up. "What happened to you?" Mr. Faberge, still on the ground, could only moan. I could see a thin red rivulet coming from his temple area. "What?" "Someone must have hit him. We need to get him inside now," Bobby said. "Hit him? But who?" As soon as I said it, I realized what a stupid question it was. It had to be the same guy that murdered Mr. Jones. If I hadn't been so slow, we might have caught the guy, Bobby said through gritted teeth. "Why, were you separated?" Mr. Forrest asked, but I could tell he wasn't condemning him. We both knew how hard it was to navigate out there. I blocked the wind with my hand and opened my eyes wide. The snow around Faberge showed some kind of violent scuffle. Yeah, but I couldn't tell if there were any footprints. After all, as we stood there, the falling snow was already rapidly covering up our own. Man, if only we had a dog. Biting his bottom lip in concentration, Bobby stared out into the sea of white. Would a normal human being willingly run out into a storm like that? Just as I was thinking, it struck me. Wasn't it more likely that we were the only people out here? Could Bobby have attacked Faberge? Maybe he hit him over the head with his mop handle and just lied about arriving late. Anyway, let's get him inside, Mr. Forrest said, picking up our weapons. I took Faberge's legs while Bobby took his hands under his shoulders. He was much heavier than I expected. Just walking alone was hard enough. How were we going to manage carrying him back? I was filled with anxiety as we started towards the front. "Not that way," Mr. Forrest bellowed. Apparently there was a back entrance that was a relief. But nonetheless, just taking a few steps in the snow, carrying a large unconscious man, took tremendous effort. Before we even made it 10 yards, my back was screaming in pain. Even Bobby was grunting with the effort. Finally, the two of them stopped walking. Mr. Forrest rang a bell. I couldn't see it, but we had arrived at the back entrance. "Hurry! Someone hurry up and open the door!" And I think we're going to stop there, but I'm going to do one more episode like usual. So we will be right back in just a moment. Having a lot of fun. I hope you guys are too. Let me know what you think. And I think it's a fun one because this is actually a game that I played that I think not nearly as many other people have played. At least that are watching anyway. But anyway, be back in a bit.